Everyone, I'm sorry we have a slight delay, but it is my great honor to welcome you all to this talk by Bracha Ettinger. And we have an additional honor, namely that we also have Catherine de Zegher, the director of the Museum of Fine Arts of Ghent, with us, who will introduce Ettinger and who will also enter into discussion with her. So I am going to be the chair of the chair tonight. Catherine de Zegher is very well known. She is a very well known curator. She just finished the Moscow Biennale, and she has done a great number of works. She worked for the Biennale of Sydney in Australia. She did a big overview exhibition on painting for the MoMA, and now she is the curator of the Museum of Fine Arts. So I give you the floor for the introduction, and then we will move on to the talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, I'm actually very pleased, of course, and honored to introduce my friend Bracha Ettinger at this conference, and thank you for inviting me, Anneleen, Masschelein, and also Steen de Kouwer. Bracha and I go back many years, too many years. And we have known each other since the early 90s, actually end of the 80s, early 90s. And by working together, we also influenced each other's work. So to rehearse a little, I will take it from the beginning. When we met, Bracha was, and of course still is, an artist and psychoanalyst. And it is in the confluence of both practices that the integrity and significance of her work can be read. Also, its deep connection to life. However, also because of this confluence, Bracha's work has constantly run the risk of being seen as falling in between two fields of experiment and knowledge, art and psychoanalysis. Meaning that she has set out for herself the challenging task of integrating both practicing and developing a coherent body of artistic and theoretical work. And it's always very difficult for artists when they practice several disciplines, because they always tend to be pushed in one or another corner while they want to do all of it together. So the strength of Ettinger's work lies in its relational and conversational aspects. In the passage, it bridges from interconnection and interdependency to transrelational, conductivity and transmission. As a matter of fact, in the elaboration of her work, generated exactly by this suspension between different practices, the in-between as the space of co-emergence, I'm using the words of Bracha, relational and fluid became hers in art and theory. And throughout this process, the notebooks, the drawings, and paintings can be seen as a kind of receptacle containing the multiple colored inks and paints, as if they were the conducive and connective fluids within a matrix. And with their absence of fixity, tending to vivacity and transsubjectivity, as well as attending to the narrative and the transient, they render Ettinger's sense of blurring the borderlines between the self and other, what has been described as a translation of souls. So to put this in a more, in a less abstract way, I was always fascinated by the way how during, at the beginning, during psychoanalytical sessions with her patients, Bracha used her notebooks and also her journals, but by 2000, she had come to carry through the creative process in her painting while she listened to the patients and drew out their stories. Of course, we can't see this literally, and she had asked the patients if she could paint or draw while they were speaking. And so in fact, in layers of mark upon mark, she traces the moment of thought being shared, as it belongs neither to the one nor to the other alone. And from this encounter, and the accretion and transformation they undergo, are carried over into the conversation traces not always from the trauma of the one in front of the analyst, but traces transmitted from the trauma of another in the psyche of the patient, from an invisible web of trans-connected others. And these are not linear stories, literally transcribed onto the page, but rather voices transformed into visual language with lines, dots, stains, and ultimately a few words and sentences. The way Ettinger works is then not specific to a particular encounter, but goes beyond trying to express thoughts or feelings. In the space of the page, the paper, the canvas, the exchanges, intimate notations, moments of silence, and transmitted translations interweave to create a visual and textual image. I called it the drawing out of voice. And in some cases, different traces from different encounters slowly accumulate over the years on the same sheet of paper, on the weave of the canvas, as she hangs the works back on the wall and takes another one and then another one. And so in a way, the artist appears to be securing the exchange and giving it a visual dimension, a voice becoming in its consequence, a voice having its fullness in being among other voices. The work then becomes a resonating receptacle for a joint consciousness of trans-subjectivity. And it's by means of her scribbled notebooks, her drawings, that Ettinger herself turned her own primary negative and wounding experience as a child and later as a young woman into a groundbreaking theory related to her artistic practice of capturing traces of traces of traces. Traces of paint and stains can be seen as dissolving lines of divides that traverse the work and contain the potential of transformation. And in withdrawing, Ettinger recognizes drawing with. Consequently, in her drawing, withdrawing receives new meaning, as in Ettinger's paintings called autist work. If drawing is a drawing with, withdrawing of lines and stains in lines and stains are moments of literally drawing out, and as such, instance of self-withdrawal expressed by means of the drawing itself stand for art's power of resistance. That is our power of resistance. From the creative conjunction of her theory and her drawing practice and her painting practice, Ettinger has brought about an altered perception of what art can be, as well as a redefinition of the feminine. And it is in the correlation of someone who listens to her patients while she draws out the stories of wounded people, draws out their traces in togetherness, and writes in her notebooks that she has come to carry through a process of recognition of this self-otherness, a process also of mutual healing of the other as well as of oneself. The artist becomes here, as she has said before, doctor and patient. And as Ettinger outlines the matrixual border space, with the image of the mother and unborn child co-emerging relation in her psychoanalytical theoretization, she continues to put her pen to paper and brush to canvas, tracing and writing her notebooks, and it results in a new approach of drawing out as caring within sharing. Communi care. To quote Bracha. This manifests itself in a later development of her work, and I haven't seen the latest work, so it will be a nice surprise today. I've seen that the images start to move. So in the beginning she used a lot of a copy machine, and then she used the scanner. So she's always, you know, using a new lens. The earlier lens of the Xerox machine, and then the lens of the scanner. Maybe new the lens of the camera. The artist considers the scanning as a process that allows her also to share intimate notes with a larger community, to connect the private and the public, transforming the notebook pages with light while erasing and veiling personal information about individuals so that the threads of the stories can continue to weave new stories with each viewer, each reader. And this apprehension of art working may well explain why the compulsive drawing and noting and painting has been so instrumental in the development of Ettinger's matrixal theory concerning the co-emergence of I and non-I. Because drawing here is intimacy as much as dialogue. To artistic gesture outwards is not only the I exist, but I exist in relation to someone else. And it reflects a vivid dialectics, or rather an act of consciousness, because the intimate gestural act is a process by which the artist relates to the other and the beholder to the work. A gesture happening within communication, commitment, and compassion, within a creative logic that is dialogic. The resulting simultaneity is not a private either or, but an inclusive also and. From celebrating a solipsistic I, Michiel Rys also posits uniqueness of the self as precisely that condition in which the necessity of the other is born. And if modernism introduced notions of the anti-narrative, negativity, separation and rupture as artistic strategies for change, the 21st century may very well be inspired by notions of inclusion, of storytelling and translation, of negotiation, of compassion and healing. And it is in this slow evolution that the work of Bracha Ettinger can play and is playing a crucial role. Thank you.
Oops. First of all, I want to thank Anneleen and Steen for inviting me to Leuven. This is a great pleasure, and also to find myself with my friends here, Catherine de Zegher, Paul Vandenbroek, who more or less, two of them saved my life in a deep sense. And then Anne Verhoekstraat, and I see Sophie van Loo, and I regret that I don't see Renate. So I'm very happy to be here. We have a long history together. I start with these 2 or 3 images. If you don't mind, I want just to turn these 3 images, and then we can look at the painting while I'm talking. You know, you can stop on each painting 1 or 2 minutes, and that's this one. And this is on a personal note, which is not written on the paper, but I want to share with you. These papers are, this is an installation in my studio that I put this paper for a month and a half. And I took photos of the installation. These papers are handwriting and printed material from of my ex-husband, when he was 19, 20 and 21. His name was Lonnie, and he was a poet and a writer and film critic. And we went and lived together in London, where he was studying in the Slade School of Fine Art. And when I started to look at the archive from that period, about 2.5 years ago, I decided more or less to stop working with patients so that I can go wherever it will take me, this trip into the work of Lonnie. And so I allowed myself to have free time in case I have a breakdown, that nobody pays the price for that. So in the last 2 years I don't see patients, and I'm going into material which is not simple for me, and so I can give direct testimony to the fact that to find a language and then deal with our trauma might take 40 years, which is a period of 2 generations, and which is directly connected to some feelings of mind when I was starting to work, and I had the feeling that I'm elaborating traces of others who, alive or not alive, belongs to the Second World War 40 years before. It starts now to make sense to me that this indeed is a period by which we or somebody else, or you for me or me for you, can carry traces of trauma in a way which is also becoming carrier of beauty or of meaning or knowledge, but it's a long process. And you can move the 3 photos and then we will go to the paintings. Now, in the context of immunity, which is why we are all here, I would like to suggest the concept of carriance, directly related to another type of relation between I and non-I, which is the non-I is not a virus and is not therefore either assimilated or rejected, but the non-I presents itself to the I in the form of carriance. I'll take Paul Celan for it when he says, "The world is gone, I must carry you." What is the meaning of that? The world is gone, I must carry you. Now, carriance is not necessarily a happy event, but it's an event to which we have to be aware, and from there some position which is ethical and also political can come into the horizon. I carry you, and therefore I have responsibility, and therefore I have the right and the obligation to attend to the other. Now, what would be the defense value of that? We have to think. What is the resistance value of it? I wrote a lot about that. So, metaphors for compassion, for rethinking immunity. Carriance, copoiesis, and co-inhabituation in the subreal. I promise to explain each concept, so for the moment just let go. Co-inhabituation and copoiesis. With the co, I join and I also differentiate myself from Varela and from Francisco Varela. And there is a talk about the way that 2 elements, I and non-I, might develop in relation to one another in a way which somehow protects also that system of co-emergence, but is not limited neither to the self nor even to the I and non-I, which are now present but to webs of connections that are open, not in an unlimited way, but open to include, to use the word of Catherine, to include one more other. And co-inhabituation takes into account the necessity of creating a home, even if we don't achieve it forever, even if it is not a home defined through identity, but still recognizing the need to create a space which is safe, which we call a home, and is not defined through borders. And the subreal, that's a bit, it's important for me to relate to the real, but also to relate to the subreal. The abstract subreal threading resonates with human, between humans, and between us and the other, and the world, and the cosmic. Invisible cords, co-weaved, find venue into the visible plane. When carriance, the idea of being carried and carrying, carriance, is sensed, it is already, we are already transcending, it is already transcended, and it can reach full-blown desire. Then the symbolic opened itself also to the subreal, to these trans-connecting threads, which are invisible, which are affective, which can be emotional, which can have many forms, and are not controlled by the 5 senses or 6 senses that we recognize. Now, what harmonizes itself with the idea of carriance is both resistance, so I'm not swallowed by the other, I'm not assimilated, but already we said I'm not rejecting because I carry, and trust. Now, trust is the most precious access to the subreal and also to the reality, I believe. But we live in a world where paranoia is so transparent that it became the norm, and we don't realize that we very often address the other through paranoiac mechanism, which is the immunity, the classical immune mechanism. Even if we then construct a community, it is still first admitting paranoia. Very Melanie Klein, by the way, and very modern, and also Freudian. When Freud says, the human infant defines what is me through defining what it rejects as non-me. And that's already a paranoid notion. Now, when we lose on that matter of trust, we are losing on a way of accessing the world. And I think that here art is extremely important, because as artists, you give yourself to your material, you trust your material, otherwise you cannot work. You love your material. And then, of course, there is a risk, because where there is trust, betrayal could come too. But so with Carriance, trust comes first. And Catherine hinted at the importance of the feminine in my theory, which is clear. The feminine and the maternal, we don't need to be father or mother to realize the potentiality of the maternal, because we've all came to the world through a carrier, maternal, female figure. And so the primal trust and all these mechanisms, which are so archaic, are also significant for accessing the other and the world, and very fragile. And therefore I also talk about witnessing before witnessing, or witnessing inside witnessing. The idea that I can witness the non-I on a certain participatory condition of with. I am with, I have been with, and I witness. These are not contradictions in the matrixial space. I think all right. You had overdose of Lonnie's archive, but now you move to the painting. So I'm talking of an emergence of a space, and I use the word space here to relate both to the human space and to the space in the painting. In the painting and in between paintings, in the drawings and in between drawings, there is a space. And that space is not defined through perspective. It's not defined through ways where I used to define space. Space of depth. Emergence of space and critique join in the passage from witnessing to witnessing in respect of the real. The passage from trans subjects to the subject happens here. And I'm talking about the truth of certain kind of love that goes with certain kind of resistance. The subject is Carriance space, and as the space subject that carries the carrier, are modi responsive to the subreal and resistant to imaginary identity. We are already in a space where it is not so easy to imagine how is it possible that I join the other without swallowing, without rejecting. Withdrawal from the surface of relationality to sense the linking, the border linking of inside kernels. It's like the way my inside relates to your inside in a, not my visible presence relate to your identity. So inside to inside, kernel to kernel. These make rooms for figuralities that reflect subreal and symbolic encounter event. The space Carriance subjects labors inside and resonate with the inside of the other subject, other object. Kernel facing kernel, kernel resonates with kernel. The shareable interiority, and I take the feminine maternal matricial sphere here as that shared yet not hostile towards the outside. Quite the contrary. The other and the outside are the partners of this kind of shareability. I cannot not share with the unknown non-I. And I don't exactly choose my non-I according to its self-proclaimed identity, and certainly not according to the identity I project on it. So we started with paintings, the depth of painting, or the relation between people, but I promise to move to biology very soon. The painting's depth also works in this kind of resonance between paintings and between me and you. The visible withdraw into its invisible kernels at the center and in the margin in order to emerge differently for each one of us. The visible withdraw into its invisible kernels. Here, what I call revelation in art appears. So I'm talking about the subject again, and some philosophers claim that there's death of the subject and the death of the author, and this kind of endless multiplicity. So let's talk about subject after the death of the subject. Let's talk about art after the death of the artist, painter after the death of painting. For all of this, we need to rethink and think through Carriance. It shows me the way to what I could imagine as the freedom in the human, freedom rifts. Initiate combat against repetition of senseless cruelty. We can talk of the heartbeat of time, off time, time off, appearing as the pregnance of space as depth. Carriance is not containing, this is something else. In Hebrew, wound, petza, and emergence, haftza'ah, share the same root. Co-emergence opens a future. Co-emergence also bleeds. But its denial is traumatizing. Its overwhelmness is traumatic. The passage from transsubjectivity, from this kernel to kernel resonance, to the subject as me, as you, or the object we tend to make of ourselves and of one another, is a withdrawal in the passage from responsibility to responsibility, from witnessing to witnessing, recognizing the difference between non-life and death, and acknowledging the passage from non-life to life, which demands a system where what we usually know as the immunity system in fact fails. As a pregnant woman, everything is, for example, not working according to the immune system, which is considered safe for life. Well, not exactly. There is something we have missed. If we don't consider the feminine, we are missing something about, not only in terms of biology, but in terms of understanding subject and understanding community. I will come back later to talk more about art, but for the moment I just continue a little on that. How will a psyche and soul and subject trust the other and trust life? Our generation inherited and lived through by within a colossal requiem. We are living a colossal requiem. Trust after the end of trust involves a subject womb space, a subject carriance space, ready to reveal and perceive the other and the subject matter, not through rejection. Withdrawal doesn't mean rejection. We need a withdrawal, aloneness, in order to create, recuperate, and come back to the other. Border linking still, even when we withdraw. Witnessing then, with Carriance, calls for a trust without abuse. Your brother's spirit, like that of Eurydice that I'm painting, like yours, is looking for rays of light. This is somehow taken from my thoughts about Paul Celan, who was endlessly thinking and feeling with the disappearance of his mother during the war. And he somehow, I feel, says, Well, don't imagine that if I talk about my mother, I imagine her only suffering and I'm talking to you only about something which is finally, ultimately negative and so on. My mother too, when I relate to her already disappearing, was hungry for beauty and for light, and that's where I join her. She sleeps near me, and both of us crawling on the floor for whatever is, which is in his language light, or we can say beauty. I'm thinking of Eva, the one, she has kids, one son a killer and one son murdered. Still she trusted life and carried the gain. And she named the son she carried Shet, which in Hebrew is close in the meaning and written in the same way as carry. And it is Shet who gave birth to Enosh, which means human. So we have the continuity through a new name that she is giving. In the Bible, in any case, the mothers gave names because the names symbolize the process through which they were giving that particular life. So it's very interesting. Enosh, human. This was her choice. After Cain and after Abel. Before Abraham and before Moses and before Jesus and before Muhammad then, before not in terms of history or mythological narrative, but as a pole in a structure of the human subject. Subject impregnated by I and non-I transjectivity, recognizes subject as nestling, co-inhabiting, co-emerging, co-arising, with and inside its own self and within one's other self. I am, thence I was carried. I am, therefore I will carry. Not necessarily in the real of the body, but in ethical terms, which are terms of the subject. Carriance, care, responsibility, witnessing, in self-fragilization. This is a direct path to ethics. And self-fragilization in front of the non-I, or the non-I as vulnerable, is a price to be paid for remaining human. And I insist on the human. I heard yesterday that maybe the human is not so important anymore. I insist on the human not because we are better than any other kind of living particles on Earth, but because we have this power of intelligence and we are controlling lots of means of the world, and therefore the responsibility of the human subject as such is necessary. As long as we want to have power, we need to have responsibility, and even if we don't want to have power, we have it, and therefore we need means of responsibility, and I insist on the human subject, connecting, transconnecting, realizing the deep connectedness that you cannot control and ruin the non-I, be it human beings or cosmic, just because of paranoia. But we have to recognize that if we do have a certain means to control the environment, then we need the responsibility of a human subject and new concepts for the subject. All recognizing the deep transconnectedness between different elements, and which is beyond the threshold of sense perception. So I like to talk about feel knowing, not only knowing through intelligence or cognition. Feel knowing the strings trembling between subject and subject, or object, or things. And this kind of transconnectedness, these kind of threads or imaginary threads, are yearning for our acknowledgement. I would like now to move directly to the question of perhaps DNA, RNA, memory in terms of more both of psychoanalysis and biology. Where are we? What we are going to see, the way I'm working on my videos is very similar to the way I'm working on my paintings, which is layer upon layer upon layer, and each time some image meets another image, and the outside of the image meets me again, and it's a very long process. And so I had in mind some 3 videos, and I started to work on 3 videos all on the same time, and after a year and a half I had 3 videos, and then after I showed them and I considered them as a work of art, I continued, and after a year and a half there was a second version, same film, same name, a new version which does not eliminate the first one. I'm now on the 3rd version of the same film, same 3 films. I'm not sure which version you see here, but you only see fragments and little pieces from that, from one of them. Maybe you will see another. I'm using materials that you will recognize, the notebooks, my own paintings, photos that I took. Here and there a moment of video, but all of this is new media worked in through the computer. And this is made with a little 1 drop of water. And it looks like the ocean, but no. Okay, I'm reading a little of Lacan. Whenever the membrane of the egg in which the fetus emerges on its way to becoming a newborn are broken, imagine for a moment that something flies off, and that one can do it with an egg as easily as with a man, namely the homelette or the lamella. The lamella is something extra flat, which moves like amoeba. It is just a little more complicated, but it goes everywhere, and as it is something, I will tell you shortly why, that is related to what the sexed being loses in sexuality, it is, like the amoeba in relation to the sexed being, immortal, because it survives any division, any Sisypharius intervention, because it survives any division, and it can run around. Well, this is not very reassuring. What is it that can run around? Surely not what we see exactly and identify. But suppose it comes and envelops your face while you are quietly asleep. I can't see how we would not join battle with a being capable of these properties, but it would not be a very convenient battle. This lamella, think of an amoeba if you wish, whose characteristic is to not exist, but which is nevertheless an organ, is the libido. What we see here, in fact, is that when Lacan relates to the libido as to an organ, or let's say an object. The libido qua pure life instinct, that is to say, immortal life or irrepressible life, life that has need of no organ, simplified, indestructible life. It is precisely what is subtracted from the living being by virtue of the fact that it is subject to the cycle of sexed reproduction. And it is of this that all the forms of the object A that can be enumerated are the representative, the equivalents. The objects A are merely its representative, its figures, the breast as equivocal as an element characteristic of the mammifer's organization, the placenta, for example, certainly represent the part of himself that the individual loses at birth and which may serve to symbolize the most profound lost object. This argument on the loss of immortality that otherwise resides in bacteria, lamella, and amoeba first found its way to psychoanalysis through Sigmund Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud's idea is similar to Lynn Margulis, if you know this, if you are acquainted with this biologist, whereby the bacterial world has retained the time when the organism was not dependent on packaged DNA like nucleated organism. Freelancing bacterial DNA and RNA did not become trapped in the nuclei of sexuality reproducing species, but remained flexible in a modular fashion, hovering between life and non-life. And I quote, "New combinations are continually being tried out. How limited and rigid life becomes as it extends down the eukaryotic path. For the microcosmic size, energy, and complex bodies we enjoy, we trade genetic flexibility. With genetic exchange possible only during reproduction, we are locked into our species, our bodies, and our generation. We trade the genes vertically through the generation, whereas prokaryotes trade them horizontally. Horizontally is like a rhizome. It's very much like the Guattari horizontality, multiplicity. The result, I continued the quote, is that while genetically fluid bacteria are functionally immortal in eukaryotes, sex become linked with death. Only for us who do not multiply like amoeba, sex and death are implying one another. If we are born, we are also going to die. If we are not born, but a result of endless multiplicity of one element, we are not going to die either. Consisting of life, the environment is continually regulated by life for life. In their alliance with animals and plants, which could not live or evolve without them, the Earth's bacteria form complete planetary regulatory system. Our first awareness of the microcosm, she continues, was hostile. The bacterial lifestyle was described when and where it threatened human society. Million bacteria evolved symbiotically to form the human brain. So we are fighting against whatever it is that in fact allowed us to become alive. That's one of the points, and this is one of the traps. Now, what we see here is that hostility between I and non-I arises since that which is just life for life is indifferent to the human being. It endangers the human being for whom, with birth, by way of reproduction, death arrived as well. Thus, for the human psyche too, militant metaphors prevail. And what the point I'm making in the context of this conference is that these militant metaphors for thinking the other are costing us more life than perhaps metaphors that could use Carriance and could use the idea of trust that goes with caring and caring that is going together with trust. Okay, you see now it's only extract fragments from the videos. We can have like 2 more minutes from this one. Thus, for the human psyche too, militant metaphors prevail. For Francisco Varela, that I'd like to honor him as well among my friends, alive and dead. And Margulis follows Varela. I quote Varela, immunological discourse is centered around military metaphors, just as strongly as cognitive science was once centered around the digital computer metaphor. Varela presents cognitive abilities of immune events to introduce, I quote, a sharp contrast to the military framework of immunity as defense. The entire biosphere, Earth, Gaia, has an identity as a whole, an adaptable and plastic unity acquired through time in this dynamic partnership between life and its terrestrial environment. It is by now classical to immunology to talk about the self-non-self discrimination. In the outer-directed self-system, information from the outside is processed. Antigen, non-self, comes in. Antibody is formed against it. Double recognition is requested. Who is non-self? And then, what kind is it? It's my friend or it's my enemy. The trouble is, Varela recognized, and I quote, recognition entails destruction. The problem was, one cannot defend without recognizing, and one cannot recognize without destroying. Even though the organism learns self-non-self discrimination during ontogeny as embryo. The mutual dance between immune system and body is the key to the alternative view he proposes, which is cognitive. Recognition, learning, and memory, and adaptation. And yet, even when defined as cognitive, Varela admits that we are still in the domain of the defensive mode. And this takes me precisely to 86, when Varela was talking for a long time, I think, about copoiesis. And I, through thinking the matrixial, feminine, maternal, was suggesting copoiesis, which does not work on the defensive mode and does not work on the rejective mode, and still I and non-I are differentiating themselves and differentiating themselves with from one another. Defensive then was the autopoiesis, too hostile still, since in autopoiesis the organism takes care of its own ontogenetic emergence only. In the I don't move from ontogenesis to community, as you see, but from ontogenesis to copoiesis and co-emergence. In the move to copoiesis, I then move elsewhere, and already as embryo I recognize the matrixial transjective jointness. The Freudian discourse about death drive, and the Lacanian metaphors of the object A, the lacking object, and the gaze is one of them. The gaze, the way we are perceived through the sense of viewing, and the drive and the desire attached to seeing. I'm talking about the drive and the desire attached to carrying and to caring. But in any case, the metaphors of object A in Lacan and the object in Freud are equally militant on the level of the unconscious psyche. And if you remember, I take Lacan for example, but you can move to Freud just as well. When the gaze appears, the subject disappears. There's always either me or you on the same territory. This then Lacanian homelet or Freudian object as other is in fact a woman-let, let in the sense of forgetfulness, forgetting the contribution of that femaleness into the idea of subject, forgetfulness of the female mother-woman body to whom the I was already clung in a sense of being carried. This sanction is veiled and at the same time offered as the condition for humanized life. If we look at this from the perspective of a male and its symbolization, it is clear why Lacan says that the maternal placenta is the most profoundly, entirely lost object, followed by the maternal breast. So the entirely lost is of course challenged here as well, together with the possibility of rejecting the non-I. Copoiesis will bypass both ontogenetic autopoiesis and symbiosis. And so I have here both Margolin and Varela as my colleagues, and also debating them. From this perspective, connectedness occurs not only by membranous folds, but by transitive mental vibrating strings. Not only mental, but this kind of materiality which is on the subreal we could discuss. Thus, we cannot talk on an entirely lost other or entirely lost object as in the past and as either in me or in my other. The idea of coemergence and copoiesis brought about the transsubjective kernel-to-kernel resonance where self and not self join without symbiosis and without hostile rejection. The object and the loss and the lost object, where are we? The object then becomes shareable between I and non-I. At the matricial space, the split between the I, or the corporeal I, I, and the desired gaze becomes a space of passage, space of interval, space of and for encounter eventing, where withdrawal and joining coincide. In the matricial sphere, copoiesis involves conductive shareability and the recognition of the conductive shareability. Here, a lack of human consciousness is a path to entropy, and the lack of compassionate hospitality is a path to re-traumatization. Art is for in the human in that sense, yet it joins that which is immortal, and because through the transcending and sensing and passage from one to the other on the subreal level. So we are a little amoeba also, small lamellas. With copoiesis, however, jointness is not hostile. It can become hostile under conditions of non-carriance. We can discuss that. Neither symbiosis nor destruction here defines the non-I and I in the encounter. And the sublimation of subreal Carriance, invisible Carriance, into symbolic trust Carriance. I think that for this transition, there is a need to start at a level which is art or aesthetic, artistic, and move from that to the ethical, and move from that to the political. With Margulies' idea of symbiosis, what I find as difficulty is not the possibility of defensive military hostility to the other, but rather that her thought might lead to the denial of the potential of the option of Carriance, that it might lead us to ignore ways of caring. Therefore, Carriance goes beyond that autopoiesis and beyond the idea of symbiosis. Now, I don't know how are we with time, how much time we have. This we can close, and you will tell me the timetable. I suppose we need to... You stop this, we can put some more light. And I don't know if I have time still to speak. I have a little bit. Okay, so after this heavy stuff, I go back to art to say a few words about how it works for me. You saw little glimpses of the work. I can say that the work is very slow in the sense that I never know. I know when I start, more or less. Even this is not sure. I never know when I will finish. And some of the works you've seen, some of the paintings, I work in parallel for 6 years, 7 years, and there is a moment when they are finished, and it's okay also, but it's a very long process, and it's a long process just as, meeting another human being also. So I'm talking about actively passive self-relinquishment in hospitality, receiving what comes in compassionate hospitality. And this begins with aesthetics and ethical desire and an actively passive decision. I put the word decision because there is a moment, decisions also again, only subjects decide. And I'm not relinquishing on that. So it begins with a kind of a decision, not that I want to do this or I want to do that or this is my subject. It's a decision to fragilize yourself and loosen your psychic boundaries in order to surrender to whatever arrives from the inside and from the inside of the outside. Matrixial compassionate hospitality as Eros creates a potential art space where you can join or participate in what is yet to come, in what from the virtual trails of the one or the other and of the encounter is in the process of becoming together. I witness whatever arrives. I feel the joy and the pain and the wonder, the longing and the fear and the languishing of the other. So outworking an act, for me, what is otherwise impossible, relations, virtual occurrences, it realizes the passage into the screen of vision, of psychic traces from what would otherwise be foreclosed from human consciousness. It comes to the definition I made between metamorphosis and metramorphosis. I see the metramorphosis as the originary human potentiality for reciprocal, yet asymmetrical, crossing of borders between I and non-I. So reciprocal, yet asymmetrical. It is here where the idea of either I carry, being carried, taking care of, responsible for the responsibility comes in. We are attached, we are connected, and at any certain moment the I will carry the instance, the subjective instance. And so what do we share in that way? Border linking and border spacing. We share the jouissance, we share the joy, but we also share trauma. It is induced in the co-emergence and also the co-fading of our relatedness. And there is a kind of knowledge at the level of the subreal, where these kernel to kernel, inside to inside, transconnect. So I am not sure we're going to have time to discuss what it means in terms of community, but I will say at least that the idea of responsibility, witnessing, and carriance helped me to make the difference between discourse, and this is very important in time of internet when we know everything immediately, and so between instances of real, I would say, ethical and even political responsibility of us when we are really responsible, and all kind of propaganda and slogans, and that we join very easily because there is this craziness of getting the object in a kind of a pervert way, I would say, pervert in the psychoanalytical way, which influences us. We know everything, we control everything, and we have opinion on everything. So the idea that I can measure my engagement, ethical and political, through the measure of my capacity to carry and become responsible is for me crucial, so that we don't fall into all kind of false ideas that we are good or we are bad, or that have to do with identity, and that has to do with signaling that which is not good and channeling aggressivity to that which is not good, but not at all in a participatory way, which is the way of carriance. So I hope this can give us ethical tool to look at ourselves and our engagement and how we engage with one another, with my non-eyes, that are far away from me, whether they are in distance from me or in proximity to me. The continuity of relatedness has to do with the continuity of caring and the capacity to carry, which is never exactly, it's not like the credit and the credo. I give you, you give me. I give you and I don't know what will happen. Is more about this asymmetrical reciprocity. We could go on what is the political meaning of the matrixial, but I will simply say that I hope in the future that the maternal and the feminine will be taken into consideration when we rethink the subject for 21st century and when we rethink the political catastrophe and the colossal requiem we are living in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a great and very inspiring talk. I think that we have some time for discussion. I propose that we just postpone the schedule. So I'll give the floor to Catherine first for a response, but we postpone the schedule with an I'm looking to stay in it. Okay, so I'm not prepared for this, but let's try.
Always call the questions from outside.
Shall we sit here?
Yes.
Yes, I know this is a conference with a very difficult topic. I'm not sure I can speak about immunity, but I'm very interested by what you were saying about this whole new tendency of the human and the inhuman, also in art, and or unhuman. And I have to admit that I immediately kind of was not interested, which of course I shouldn't do, but because it's appearing everywhere, and so you see a lot of art. The examples I saw were in Canada, where they clone and they make things out of human tissue, and yes, it's very, to me it's kind of scary. So how do you look at this kind of work, and how do you see it? It's really, I mean, it's more linked to biology, and I think maybe I should leave this to the people in the room, because I don't know what to do with it. So your analysis of the Anubi is, of course, and life, the connection of life, and how, you know, you don't die if you can endlessly reproduce yourself in a way.
So you see the beginning. Do you hear? You see the beginning of the answer. I think that this is symptomatic of the speeding up of time, this incapacity to take. I mean, artists like everybody else, we are overwhelmed. I think that the 20th century overwhelmed our senses, and then with all the new media and everything that comes to us. And I see in it a panic reaction, as if we say, okay, if we attach ourselves to the units that never dies, even Facebook, if we attach to ourselves to this microbe that never dies, we carry continuity of life through them, and the hell with the idea of we need this kind of, but there is a lot of contradiction. You know, it goes together with the tendency to look after all the animals and to accept it. And so there's still a lot of confusion. But for me, the interesting thing takes us precisely to a certain, like a confusion of the beginning of the 20th century. Because when you read through the lenses of what was talked about, even in the end of the 18th century, there's always this idea how to reach kind of an eternal life. And you can reach eternal life if you indeed give up the human. And I think that Freud says this in a very simple way. The death drive is particular to human beings, because they are born, and from being born already induces, and as Margoli says, life works for life, and I would say life works for life doesn't need us. Okay? The cosmos doesn't need us, light does not need us, even beauty does not need us. But art is about beauty that needs us, it's about the human. And if we don't give up the idea of ethics, which I will never give up, then we cannot give up the idea of the human. Even the human who's doing this kind of a work of art had already taken an ethical decision. So when we have to do with elements that split endlessly, we are in the domain of this horizontality, and it can take you to Deleuze and Guattari, and we can have a philosophical discussion as well, and you can go to Spinoza. There's no life where there are these cells that split themselves forever. You can clone, you can do. Today we can do it better. Let's say technologically, scientifically, we can do it better. So why so many artists are fascinated by that? I don't know. Maybe it's a matter of thinking, and indeed, I'm not interested in that.
It's okay, I have some questions from the room, but we will, in order not to completely mess up the schedule, I'm going to have a few questions, and then hopefully we can continue this discussion over the rest of the day. But I'm sorry, otherwise the whole program will be so I have one question here, so let's say 3 questions from...
Yes, I wanted to ask a little bit more about politics, so the final part of your presentation that I think you left out, so maybe you have some thoughts about this. So regarding Carriance as what you call the not necessarily happy event, and trying to think about the political articulations of Carriance, I wondered if your investment in Carriance at, let's say, the personal and interpersonal level also translates politically in an investment in, for example, the carrying state, the welfare state, the nanny state, the maternal state, one could say. Talking about art institutions, since we have Catherine here as well, does that then also translate into an investment in the museum or the gallery, for example, as a Carriance institutions taking care of artists? I mean, you talked about your collaboration for years. This seems very important in this context. And then also thinking a little bit about the train strike today. What about infrastructures like the railway system, for example, that carry us to institutions from place to place? Does all of this psychoanalytic discourse translate in investment in those infrastructures, institutions, and potentially political organizations?
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so, in the sense that I think that we have what we have seen with the questions of imperialism and question of 19th century and before, is a discourse that says, okay, if you have power, then you control, and so on, as if what we have to do is only resist to all kind of systems. So you have a kind of a chaotic everything goes versus structures of power, which are... Now I'm trying to reassociate through the maternal and the matrixial that if we do have, for example, as a mother, I have more power than the baby. It depends on me, right? But it doesn't mean the power is not for control. The power is for carriance and responsibility. We have to change it in the mind first. Where you have people who stand in the head of what states and departments, and they use their power for other from other reasons, which would be a certain kind of economy, a certain kind of military, and so on. So this is already, for me, the pervert paranoid system. So the change should be, I believe in it, but it needs awareness, right? When I see, I don't know, a political leader talks in the name of compassion on this and that, I really want to run away. I think we need to think and feel what is the meaning of that. I mean, every word one can use symbolically in the service of another system. So, yeah, what is the meaning of carry? What does it mean? What is the position it puts me? If I get more power, get more carrying. Do I have enough carrying capacity to stand at the head of that institution? Yeah, it's a question I hope we will ask. And it does not come from the symbolic paternal that we know, from the Oedipus, but it doesn't come from the horizontally anti-Oedipal, endlessly rhizomatic, because then you have a kind of an anarchy, and we know that in that kind of system, the first to suffer and die are those who are vulnerable. So between this and that, these are the joys, the jouissance of the same system for me. I hope for a different system in which we realize deeply that when the non-I suffers, I suffer too. And both of us need to work for a change. The I and non-I have to have another relationship. I don't swallow you. I don't reject you. but I am traversed by your suffering. Okay? Here again, the maternal and the paternal, I mean, I don't mean it male or female, I mean the male and female in the maternal would know the meaning of what we are talking about.
I just want to say that I'm very happy to hear that remark, because that's exactly what we need to do. You know, I'm very lucky now that I can run a museum and exactly work in that direction. So yeah.
And I will add that it needs a lot, when you have other ideas, it needs a lot of courage, because the systems are already here. You have both to resist, not to destroy, and bring other values. Now the value cannot only be the economical value, the value of money, the value of military, to change the value. How can we put value into the idea of caring, you know? It's very important.
Yes, I would like to invite you to talk a little more about the relationship between care and immunity. Because the way, I mean, it appears in Esposito's book on Immunitas, the example of the fetus that's not rejected and for whom the immune response, the threshold is lowered in a way in order to accept this parasitic relationship actually. At the same time, the only immune components that the infant has is the mother's, and that's why breast milk in a certain way transfers antibodies as part of maternal care to the young child until it's around 2 to 3 years old. I mean, at least the first year it has practically no ability to build an immune system other than the mother's. So in a way there is a relationship between care and defense that makes it very difficult, you know, to only see the communal shared and the transversal in a way as an ethical dimension. And I think on the level of the museum, you would have to say it's very difficult in today's world not to be able to defend the museum. And so I think there it gets very difficult to find a really ethical stance.
Thank you for that question. I will say it like that. And it's not a question of time, historical time, a question of worries and intellectual thinking and philosophy. Where the question with yesterday's lecture, Esposito and so on, begins, ended, says, okay, I take all this, and then I arrive here, where I started, and it's already far away with other ideas of what is community and what all of that. I started there where I'm amazed to see that we arrive into the question of community without at all taking into account in a different way, thinking of the maternal, matrixial, fetal, and so on, which is a thinking goes on for us at least for 30 years, which only shows that we really need to share a bit more between disciplines and ask ourselves what goes on here. So I cannot even begin to reply, because my thinking about what is community, following the rethinking, the archaic motherhood and the infant and the fetus and all of that, is already reached a different zone altogether, in which I think some of the questions are already have a certain reply, good or bad. Some, the questions now are already very different. Now, on one level, we talk about the fact that one is dependent on the other, on another level, and this is why I don't say interrelationship, and I don't say symbiosis, and I don't say parasitic, on another level, talking about the transensitivity and transsubjectivity is another idea. Because the idea of community, how it was, I'm just saying one word, if we can, we don't have, okay, we have the idea that in any case, no matter how we think about it, symbiotic, less symbiotic, you have whatever called, and then mother, for that, and she has her history, he is for the moment like this, but then, okay, but basically two points with their center, which will become subjects, and if they're happy enough, they will communicate in interrelations later on, right? Now we don't really understand, and this is what for me, why the metaphor of the maternal and uterus. So we don't really understand that on a subreal level, it had never been this and that, and it had never been destined like that, but neither like thousands and millions of possibilities of connection, because you have this time-connectedness between one and one and one and the other, and this goes on in parallel. So we can have one language to talk about containing and parasite, and another language to talk about another sphere, and it's another sphere for me in subjectivity, which is not recognized. And in it, the definition of community that I heard a little, I heard only the beginning of the lecture, that doesn't work, because community is for this one and this one that decide for defensive reasons to put themselves together, or for offensive reasons most of the time. So when I define the I and non-I as beyond the boundaries, it's not like let's try to find a way to think of the I and the non-I beyond the boundaries. It is the point where I began my thinking to arrive to where we heard today. So it will take us a deep seminar, if you want, to start to compare to start to realize also the political implication, and start to compare what we mean. There is a book on community that I think also compared already these different attitudes. I have to find it. I didn't have time to present the matrixial sphere today and how it works there, but there are connections and links and capacities for linking that has nothing to do with identity, okay? And this continues. And even if the biological entities are different, the model of that I rely on has to do with those connections that continue. And so boundaries are redefined, me and you are redefined, identity is put a bit to the side, and it's not the interests of an identity that produces communities. Caring is another idea.
Okay, so I think that we'll have to close off here, and we'll have a seminar tomorrow so we can continue this discussion. This is to be continued. People are welcome if you want to come to the seminar tomorrow. Now we're going to have a 45 minutes break, so we're going to start again at 1:30 sharp, because we just slowly hope to more or less stay on the schedule. So 1:30 we start again here on the second floor or in the 8th floor of the other building. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you very much.